Good morning. Welcome back to the Red Mic. Happy Tuesday. Happy Mardi Gras. Glad you're here. Today also starts early voting in Texas. Between now and the May runoff, a good number of primary winners will lock in a real advantage. In fact, a lot of these primary winners will end up just walking in because they won't have any serious competition in the fall. If they're not a shoe-in, you know, it's definitely leaning in their favor. Which brings me to elections. And as promised yesterday, a discussion of 1876 and Sam Tilden. Samuel Tilden won the popular vote for president. Everybody involved knew it. Everybody involved admitted it. But the country was exhausted. The Civil War was not that far in the rearview mirror. They were exhausted from Reconstruction, exhausted from violence and uncertainty. And I forgot to bring my mic in, so I hope I'll fix the audio in post. So the alleged adults stepped into a room and they created a commission. They negotiated a deal and told the country this is the right outcome for stability. Now, they weren't acting in bad faith. They weren't trying to burn the system down. They genuinely believed this was the least bad option. But that's where the story really starts. But before we get into it, just a reminder again, Red Mike Messages are leadership and life lessons picked up mainly from 25 years as a public servant, 16 years as a youth football coach and scouting volunteer, and 10 years as a mediocre athlete with far more heart than actual physical ability. Back to Tilden and the election. There's a lie we like to tell ourselves that if you work hard, you follow the rules, keep your nose clean, and you do the right thing, the outcome will take care of itself. Well, not to be overly cynical, but history says otherwise. Tilden wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't corrupt. In fact, he ran against corruption. He won the popular vote. He had enough electoral votes to be one short of the presidency. The remaining votes were disputed. Reasonably, there was a lot of fraud going on. He probably won South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon, but he didn't. The rules got flexible. They got into these back rooms, and then Congress created a special commission after the election. Not before. There was no law. It's not in the Constitution. They did all this after. And every single disputed vote, there were 20 of them, I think, went to the other guy, Hayes, completely on party lines. Now, Tilden at that point had options. He could have tried to burn the thing down politically. He could have rallied his supporters. There could have been another civil war. He could have challenged the legitimacy of the outcome, but instead, he stepped aside. Not because he was wrong, not because he lost the argument, but because he believed the country couldn't survive another rupture. So yeah, he did everything right, but he still lost. Here's a big part of his legacy, and I mentioned this a little bit yesterday. His supporters didn't forget. All across the South and in some pockets of the North, to this day, you find Tilden streets, avenues, schools, Tilden parks, Tilden townships. There's actually a Tilden, Texas, east of here. I don't know where exactly. There's government buildings that still have his name on them. Not because he governed there, but because he never did. In the minds of his supporters, what was rightfully his was stolen. That's why in the streets of the president names in my hometown, Wichita Falls, nestled in there, you'll see Tilden. And for most of my life, I thought, oh, there was a President Tilden. No, there wasn't, but there probably should have been. Now, that kind of naming is not nostalgia. It is grievance cast in concrete. Those names, well, they're a quiet protest, a way of saying we remember what happened. It's a passing resentment, moving it forward throughout time without having to argue it every generation. It's resentment, a reminder etched into daily life. It's saying this was wrong, we did not consent, and we're not going to forget. And that resentment wasn't just about Tilden the man. It was about the feeling that playing by the rules didn't matter if the rules could be rewritten afterward. It was anger and resentment that legitimacy could be decided behind closed doors, that the right outcome depended less on votes and more on the power of the people who were in the back hall room. That kind of resentment doesn't burn hot, but it does smolder. And it shows up decades later as distrust of institutions, suspicion of the process, a reflexive belief that outcomes are managed, not really earned. Tilden became a symbol not of rebellion, but of quiet injustice, a patron saint, if you will, of doing everything right and still losing. And that might be more dangerous as far as losses go, because it teaches people that obedience doesn't lead to fairness and restraint doesn't lead to reward. History may not repeat itself, but it sure echoes. And I think you still see echoes of that type of distrust today. Now, after 1876, Tilden never ran for president again. He declined efforts to position him for another major political role. He was still admired by Democrats, most of them actually, but the outcome left him really disillusioned, especially with the party leaders who urged him to accept everything rather than fight the result in Congress or the courts. He lived comfortably, but increasingly private. His health declined. He withdrew from public life. But here's sort of a funny twist, if you will. His greatest legacy, honestly, didn't come from him going into office. It came after his death. When he died in 1886, he left the bulk of his fortune to establish what became a cornerstone of American civil life, the New York Public Library. Millions of people benefit every year from that institution it was in part built by a guy who never held the office that he probably rightfully won. There was a Tilden Trust established, and that helped, along with some other well-heeled New Yorkers, ended up funding that library. Just like those streets, museums, parks, and everything named for him throughout the South and again in pockets of the North, the name Tilden is emblazoned on the front of the New York Public Library. And I think the lesson is, yes, Sam Tilden did everything right by the standards of his time. He won the popular vote. He followed the rules. He stepped aside to avoid national unrest, but he still lost. But what happened wasn't bitterness in office, but quiet withdrawal, symbolic remembrance, and a legacy that outlasted power. His other legacy, I think, is doing the right thing doesn't guarantee the right outcome. Integrity is not a vending machine. Unresolved injustice doesn't disappear. It gets memorialized, sometimes in concrete, sometimes in the hearts and minds of your supporters and those people who come after you and after them. Stability achieved without legitimacy breeds long-term distrust. Restraint may preserve the peace, but it often transfers that cost to the future. And sometimes the most dangerous lesson a system can teach is this: you can do everything right and still lose. That's not cynicism, that's history, as was today's Red Mike message. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it helpful. Hope you're able to put some of these things in place in your own life. I appreciate you being here. Again, a reminder, it is the beginning of early voting in Texas. So Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whatever you are, go vote. You can complain after if you don't, but it's going to ring hollow. So go support whoever you support. Go do your part. I'll see you again tomorrow. Don't forget, as always, life is short. Drink the bourbon. I'll see you.